Hello, everyone. Welcome to another awesome day at Roots Tech. First class of the day. We've got, this class on the record, an introduction to civil registration in Ireland. This will be by Daniel Loftus. He's a genealogist specializing in Irish genealogical research and research into mother and baby institutions around Ireland. He is the creator of Project Infant, which endeavors to record the names of those who died in mother and baby institutions, amongst other institutions around Ireland. And with that, we'll turn the time over to Daniel.
Thanks so much, Nate. Okay, everybody, thank you for coming along, and let's not waste any time and let's get straight into it. So, before we do get going, I do want to go through some housekeeping. So, a little bit of a preamble. On February 25th of this year, Irish Genealogy, the state government website for accessing births, marriages, and deaths, was changed. So the website looks quite different. So I did have a supplementary YouTube video that I had done on how to use the new search, which I'm not going to be covering in this talk. So if you go to my YouTube channel or whatever, it'll be there. To access any handout or slides that I've done in this talk, they'll be at the bottom of the web page. However, what I will do after this talk is try and amend some of the slides to add updated screenshots, etc. And I will forward them on, and I will try and hopefully send them on as quick as I can so that they can go online as soon as possible. So other than that, I don't think there's anything else to do other than get into the talk. So what I hope to kind of talk to you about today is how civil registration began in Ireland. Where did it begin? What is on Irish genealogy? What's available to us? What can't we access? What limitations there are? And what information can we get on the entries, the births, the marriages, the deaths? It's one of my favorite collections to use when doing genealogy, because more often than not, it gives us an insight into our ancestors that can often be the way that we break down a brick wall. It's been the main helping factor through much of my research, and it's a collection I use on a daily when doing my research into mother and baby institutions. So it's a big part of my research, and I imagine for anyone who does do Irish genealogy as well, it'll be a big part of yours too. So first, let's start with a little timeline. So I put in 1837 because when we were still the Great Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, we didn't have civil registration. When England and Wales started having it in 1837. The first degree of civil registration in Ireland started in 1845, when at that time it was only recording any marriage of a non-Catholic denomination. So Presbyterian, Church of Ireland, anything like that, it would record. And then from the 1st of January 1864, the civil registration begins for all events in Ireland, so births, marriages, and deaths in Ireland of any religious denomination, Catholic, Presbyterian, any of that. It was all recorded. Now, for this, what is available? I had this updated to include what this year will eventually upload to Irish genealogy. It does not currently have 1924 births, 1949 marriages, or 1974 deaths yet as of March the 7th. However, I suspect sometime later in March, we will have 1924 births, 1949 marriages, and 1974 deaths. So images for entries from 1871 to 1973 are only available for deaths online. There are no images for anyone prior to 1871. So I will talk about that a little later on. But I do want to just mention that. And for birth, marriages, and deaths for any counties of Northern Ireland, they are only available up to 1921. because when the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed in December of 1921, that meant that when the split happened, we no longer have any birth, marriages, or deaths for any counties of Northern Ireland. Only the General Record Office of Northern Ireland, or GRONI for short, will have those. So when you do any sort of research in Irish genealogy, you will tend to come across sooner or later irishgenealogy.ie. So this is a state-run website run by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Inclusion and Youth. Or no, sorry, wrong wrong department there. I'm getting mixed up with something else. My apologies there. It's Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media. My apologies. And it was launched in the mid-2010s, and it has been one of the main reasons that people have been able to find their Irish ancestors quite easily, because it gives us access to a plethora of births, marriages and deaths. So let's take a look at a birth entry first. So here is the birth entry of my great-grandaunt Bridget Loftus. So on the left, going from left to right, we can see we've got her, the entry number is here. We got the date and place of birth. We've got the name, we got the sex, so female. We've got the father's name and residence. So it was John Loftus in Rosslevin, which is in Bohola. So again, if you happen to have any ancestors there, let me know, because we might be related. So John Loftus in Rosslevin, and then we have Mary Loftus, formerly Burke, which was his wife. And then John's occupation is given as a landholder. Then the next column is the informant. So Honor Highland is her name, Honor Highland, or Honora. It could be some name like that. And in between her name, we've got a little X, which means it was her mark, so it was her signature. And that was typically seen in people who were illiterate and couldn't read and write. Then we can see where she was based. So she was based in Rosslevin, which would actually make sense to me later on when I went back checking through records. Then we got the registration date. So March 25th or March 26th even of 1874. The registrar signature. I'm not even going to try and read that. Now, this last column, I don't tend to see used an awful lot. However, that's not to say that it's not used, because the last column is for baptismal names if added after registration of birth and the date that it was added. So when I was doing research into something completely different, I come across this entry. So originally we had this baby Beecher, who was born on the 5th of December in 1878 in Castlehyde in Ballyhooly, Fermoy in Cork. And this baby was born to John W. Beecher of Castlehyde and his wife, Emily Hare. He was a gentleman, and the father registered it. So it was originally registered on the 7th of January in 1879 by Patrick Sweeney, the deputy registrar. But as we can see, the last column is filled in because they added a name later on. So Hilda would turn out to be this child's name, and they would add her name in to the birth to the birth record on the 15th of April 1879. So it was after presumably the baptism as well. And one thing that you will notice is with some births, and if you were trying to find a corresponding baptism, especially for any birth prior to 1880, 1881, that period of time, you may find that the dates are somewhat out of kilter. So, for example, this is the same Bridget Burke or Bridget Loftus that I showed you earlier. So this is her birth entry or snippet of it, where you can see February 2, so February 2nd of 1874 was the date of birth for Bridget in Rosslevin. However, when I went looking for her corresponding baptism later on, I could see that, oh, we've got a different date here. She was baptized on the 31st of January, 1874. So I know we can do a lot on the internet now, and that includes like pre-ordering things, but I'm not exactly sure if pre-ordering baptisms would have been a thing in those days. So we've got the baptismal here, but we can see it's the right one, where I had John Loftus and Mary Burke, and I did check again to make sure it was the right one. We got the sponsors, Thomas Hyland and Anne Burke. Anne is Mary's sister, and Thomas would be a relative of Mary's as well. The residence, so in Rosslevin, so that lines up with the birth as well. But the only thing that doesn't line up is the date of the baptism being the 31st of January, corresponding with the birth being the 2nd of February. Now, why might that have been? So, when the rules surrounding civil registration was that when the birth had occurred, notice of the birth had to be given within 3 weeks of the birth occurring, and full details had to be provided within 3 months. So, you would have to register some semblance of the birth after 3 weeks and within 3 months. And sometimes the dates could be slightly altered to potentially avoid a late registration fee, as we can see with Bridget's. Then we go to marriage entries. So these, so looking from left to right, we got the entry number, we got the date of marriage. So this is for my great-grandparents, John Loftus and Ella Noon. I always use these people in my presentations because it just works a lot of the time. So I have John Loftus and Ella Noon, March 15th of 1911. They were both full age, which means that they were over 21. If they were recorded as a minor, it means that they were under 21, but typically over the age of 18. In other cases, it may also give an age in the age column. So it might say, because for example, at the time, I think John was 30, would have been 34 at the time, and then Ellen would have been best part of 26. So it also could have given the ages respectively, and then it gives their condition. So bachelor and spinster. However, in John's case, this is actually his second marriage, as I later found out. So the bachelor in this case is not necessarily correct, but I'd argue that 9 times out of 10, it is quite precise. John's occupation was given as a farmer, whereas Ellen wasn't recorded with one. Then some information here about where they were living at the time, which does help, especially if you're trying to, I suppose, look for common or people with very common names. And sometimes a location can be an instrumental piece of information when trying to find your ancestors in civil records or something else. Then we got the fathers' names of both John and Ellen. So John's father was John Loftus. I think the third generation of John's, and he was a farmer. And then Ellen's father was Michael Noon, and he was also a farmer. Then down here, we can see this marriage was solemnized between us. So it writes the name, so John Loftus and Ellen Noon, in the presence of us, Patrick Philbin and Sarah Noon. Now, the number 3 I have there is the witnesses' names. So the part here might come in handy because if you're doing fan research, or for those of you who aren't necessarily sure what that acronym means, it means friends, associates, and neighbors. So it can sometimes help fill in the gaps in terms of trying to find out who people in your family might be. And for example, I have not figured out how Patrick Philbin knew John Loftus or Ellen Noon, but I know that Ellen is actually Sarah's sister. So that gave me an inkling as to who that was. And that's that one. However, in 1956, and the way I know it is it was the year after my grandparents, or one set of grandparents, got married, they actually introduced a new format for marriages. So in 1956, they added some new things. So I want to show you an example of that. So this is my grandparents, Donal O'Clery and Catherine Ann Whelan. And I've highlighted in the blue boxes in terms of what's new to this. So first blue box here is, instead of age, they've actually changed it to date of birth. So they actually tell you when the bride and groom were born. So I can see my granddad was 21st of November of 1932. And then his wife was Catherine Whelan, who was born on the 14th of May, 1936. And then on the end here, I really like this, where they included both parents' names. And could you only imagine how far we get in our research if this is done back in 1864? It would be nice, but, better late than never, as they say. So I can see Donal and Catherine's parents are, ironically, both called Patrick and Catherine. I can see the irony there, but it's sort of... they weren't always known as Patrick and Catherine. They all had their nicknames. So you had Padraig, you had Kathleen, and then you had Pax and Caught, basically a nickname that Patrick had, and then Caught being the Irish for Catherine or Kate. And then the last column here was the intended future permanent residence. So it tells you where they were hoping to end up living in. So they were they were intending to live in 5 Sarsfield Street in Clonmel in Tipperary. So that's what that gives me, which I really like that addition. So if you order any certificate after 1956, you will have this new format rather than this one, which is really nice. So in the death entries, we get this kind of information. So we get the entry number, we get the date and place of death. So I can see John died on the 8th of August of 1957. So it writes the number, and then sometimes it'll write in the words 50 and the words 50 and 7. So August 8th, 1957. And John had died in Treen Duff in Bahola in Kilchima. So I could get the name. Sometimes it'll give a middle name depending on the person. It doesn't always, though, so just bear that in mind. But if you have a known middle name, it can sometimes help you figure out the death or any sort of record, if it is them or not. So I can see male. So I can see the conditions. So John is listed down as being married. So this can help you, first of all, determine whether any of the John Loftuses I look at are mine. Now, thankfully, there weren't that many in that time period because I had an inkling of when I was looking. But if it says married, then that gives you an idea as to whether the bride or the groom died first. So John, or the husband or the wife. So John had died first, and I would later find Ellen's death cert in 1963. So I knew that when I was looking for Ellen's death certificate, I could use the 1957 date as a starting point to try and find Ellen's. So when I'm looking on Irish genealogy, I could look for Ellen Loftus, who died anytime after 1957 to when the collection ends at the moment. So if it obviously tells you widow or widower, then it gives you a stopping date. So for example, say if Ellen had died before John, and John was recorded as being a widower down in 1957, I could do a search on Irish genealogy for any deaths of Ellen Loftus from 1923, which is the day, or which is the year that the last child was born, up to 1950, up to 1957, as so like to help narrow down a search. Then we got the age. The age is something to also take with, I suppose, a bit of a pinch of salt. Now, technically, they would have been right if John had lived a little longer, up to December the 1st. So he was 80, but he would have turned 81 that year. So in this case, it gave me a fairly accurate idea of when to look for birth if I was looking for one, or if I could look for one, based off of what's online and what's available. It tells me he was a farmer. It gives me his cause of death. So you can see it says cardiac failure and then senility. On most death certificates, it tends to give a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary cause. So it gives 3 causes. So not always, but sometimes it will, depending on the death itself. And then underneath it says uncertified. So what that means is that the death itself wasn't certified by a medical professional, that perhaps it might have been oh, he might have had trouble with his heart, and that's probably what it was. But if it says certain, that means the cause of death had been signed off on by a medical professional or someone in the medical area. So the person who registered the death was Luke Loftus, his eldest son, where he was living in Treneduff. He was living in the family home, and Luke would die in the same house. I think 27 years later. Then the registration date, so October 26th of 1957, and then the registrar over here. Now, one thing I should also mention with any sort of death entry that you look at is there were rules in terms of, I know this because I was looking into a death that happened in 1938 and wasn't registered. And I couldn't quite figure out why. And it turns out that if the death, so this is the Civil Registration Act of 1880, so traditionally it would state that all deaths had to be registered regardless. So obviously in line with the fact that it had to be done within 3 weeks to 3 months of the death happening. And I'd noticed that it turns out there was a little addendum that if the death was investigated by a coroner, they would have to do it within a matter of days after the inquest would close. And if they did not do that within such kind of a period of time, then they would not have to register it. Like if they didn't do it, then they didn't have to. So I've come across one where they didn't register it for whatever reason. So if you see a death that's reported by a coroner, count your lucky blessings that they did register it. Because if the coroner didn't register it themselves, then there was actually no onus on the family themselves to do it either. So if the coroner didn't register it, then the family didn't have to either. So it's worth bearing that in mind if you can't necessarily find a death for someone, as I found. Now, granted, the death that I was looking at was in an urban setting, so it might be more likely to occur there potentially rather than out in a rural setting, like with John's case and Ellen's case. So it's worth bearing that in mind. So some search tips, I believe, are in order. So tip number one I'd have is utilizing other records to see if you can help narrow down a search. So, for example, when I used the example I gave with John, John and Ellen's last child was their last son, James, who was born in December of 1923. So I would use any date or the last date that I know that they would have been alive to look for a record. So, for example, James being born in 1923, and I know that I used the example of if I had found Ellen first, I would know that John would have had to have died sometime before Ellen died in 1963, but after James in 1923. Now, granted, I know that's a 40-year gap, but in my case, it worked for me in that situation, but it mightn't always work. So what you might want to do is make sure that you or look through what you have on someone and see, is there a date that you can use to help pinpoint or to help refine that search window down a little bit. Another tip I have is to use lengthened versions of names. So what I mean by that is if you have we'll say like Jimmy or Johnny, Jimmy, Johnny, whatever. You have James or John. So try and use the more, I suppose, traditional spelling of it, because nicknames wouldn't necessarily always appear. So we all know someone in our family by some nickname, I'm sure. And if you were trying to find a record for them, if you tried searching by that nickname, chances are it would not come up. Another thing I do is searching a name using the least amount of variance. So if I was looking up a marriage between, we'll say, an O'Connor and a a Carol, I know that Carol will probably have less variance in terms of how it could be input into Irish genealogy. So Carol could be Carroll or Caroll. But if I was doing O'Connor, then it could be an O apostrophe Connor, or it could be an O, then a space, then Connor, or it could also just be Connor. So it's worth bearing that in mind as well. Another thing to do is to note the location of events. So if I flick back to the marriage entry for John and Ellen real quickly, I have Rosslevin as where John was living at the time. Now, when I was looking at Bridget, I could have some certainty in knowing that there's a very good chance, had I found a birth for John, that they would all line up, and luckily they did. So it's worth bearing that in mind. So got the marriage there, and then okay, back to this. Okay, so and as bizarre as the last one sounds, it's actually surprised me, because if you search with someone's middle name as their last name, you might find something that you weren't necessarily expecting. Because I was doing research into mother and baby homes, and I was looking through a load of Cork death records, and I was just scanning through them. And what I noticed was that on some of the records that came back, so say, for example, it was John Michael Smith. The name might have been recorded as the first name being John and the last name being Michael, even though Michael wasn't his last name. His last name was Smith. And I have noticed that in a number of cases, and it's surprising how, I suppose, prevalent it is. So if you're ever going around in circles and you really just don't know where to go with it, perhaps maybe use that next time. Another thing that I want to also put in is about the ages. So one thing that I noticed as well when I was doing that research was when I was looking for, we'll say, children who died age 0 and 1, I was coming across kids who might have died at people who died at 80, but it was recorded as age 0, so it should have been 80 rather than 0. Or I might have seen someone as 11 rather than 1-year-old. So I have come across people who appear to be children in the death indexes or the death results, but they might not necessarily be. So as weird as some might look, even if you just do a search for John Loftus and you look through, there's a little bit of, I suppose, certainty in knowing that you tried to look for them. If you don't put an age in, you might have a rough age, but even if you do put in an age, there's no guarantee that it couldn't be one of those predicaments. Now, I mentioned about some of the parts of this slideshow being somewhat out of date. With Irish Genealogy now, they've kind of done away with the advanced search and have kind of all incorporated the civil record search function and the church record search function into one search form. So if you were to go onto irishgenealogy.ie now during this presentation, you would see it's a completely new website, as I mentioned, and the search form is all amalgamated into one. So they've kind of done away with this, but you can still look for births with the mother surname. You can still look for marriages with the second party. So again, I'm going back to, if I was looking for the O'Connor and Carroll marriage, I could do O'Carroll. Sorry, it could also be O'Carroll, now that I'm thinking about it. Another way of putting it. So if I did like Carroll here, and then I went looking for O'Connor, or I did O'Connor, then looking for Carroll, whatever way I wanted to do it, I can do that. And yeah, another search technique is actually, now I'm just seeing the civil registration thing, is if you are dealing with, because I've helped a few people whose ancestors were on kind of the border of, or kind of bordering between two districts, and for some reason they might have done some things in one and another and some things in another district. Just bear in mind, don't just kind of keep your I suppose dead center on one particular district. But I do have some resources in the handout on where to find a list of registration districts throughout Ireland, along with some other helpful tools. So, speaking about lengthened versions of names. So, for example, I do apologize for this. This should have, it was fine when I was making it. Now it's gone around. So, if I had Biddy, Bridie, Bridget, or Delia, these would all trail back to Bridget. And granted, Brigid and Bridget are interchangeable. So, you could swap either one out. But I just did that as the root name, as I call it. Then, with the name of least variance, if I was to look for O'Sullivans and Leahys or McCarthy's and Loftuses, if these are the marriages I was looking for, I would try and go for Leahy, as there's not really the factoring in of an O and apostrophe in. So I got O'Sullivan, but it could also be O'Sullivan without a space as well. So it's worth noting down a few of those things too. Additionally, going back to my earlier point about noting down the locations, you can see here one thing that these three events have in common is the district, the registrar's district. So you can see in the district of Kilchima, in the registrar's district of Kilchima, in the district of Kilchima. So these were all things that factored in. So the kind of one that supersedes that is Swinford. So you can still see Swinford. So chances are, if you have people who didn't necessarily move around like my father's family did, it might give you an idea of where to look, and that they probably didn't necessarily move, or the district wouldn't necessarily have changed, but some locations might have, because, for example, in Kilchima, in Bahola, in Kilchima. Or, well, sorry, the Church of Bahola even in Kilchima. So that bit didn't change. But another thing I also do is I find myself a very visual person, which is why I try not to do too much text in my slides, and I tend to just ramble on, is I like to see things on a map. So, for example, what I've done is I had plotted where, I suppose, the events happen. So you can see I've got 3 pins here. So I got a green one here, an orange one there, and a kind of a brown, blackish looking one there. So the green one here signifies where the birth took place. So this took place in Treenduff, in Rosslevin, in Bahola. There's Bahola, the little village. So I have that there. And then the death was in the Kilchima district. And I should also say the death was in Rosslevin, Treenduff, that area here. So these 2 pins probably actually sit over another. But I could see that was where the nearest district was. Because if I were to plot where all the districts were, I could see I had Swinford here, I had Castlebar there, and Claremorris. And these are all districts, the blue pins. So I could see that majority of the things, and I wasn't sure about Kilchima, but I could see that the Bahola events were quite close to the Swinford district. So that's where I focused my search first. But if I didn't get lucky with the Swinford district, and they might have for some reason gone to Castlebar or Claremorris, maybe not Claremorris, but if they might have gone to Castlebar, I would have seen that as well. So it's all about expanding your search, expanding your horizons, and then trying to make sure that you, I suppose, pull in anywhere and anywhere, or anywhere and everywhere, I meant to say, into your search, and to incorporate that into your research too. So the civil registration districts, I was on about this. So this is on Irish Genealogy Toolkit by Claire Santry. So you have a text list of all the districts under the counties. I could only fit so much in one little screen wrap there. The link to this is in the handout, along with a couple of other versions. There's one to the National Library of Ireland, who had done a map version. So they'd done a kind of colored map. So if you like the kind of black and white style map, you can use Claire's one here. Or if you want one that has a splash of color, the NLI, or the National Library of Ireland's one, does have that kind of color element in it. However, when we often talk about civil registration and we always think, oh, everyone has to be recorded, that's when we ask ourselves, is everything recorded? Because I want to use an example of my own grandfather's family. So when I was making this, I always tried to figure out, right, how can I add in a splash of color and tie it in to the whole idea of Roots Tech in talking about our own family? Because the research is fairly, fundamental, and it's quite, facts and all. But when we do our research, there's always people behind them. And these are the people behind my dad's family. So my grandfather is here, second from the right, Michael, right smiler. And then we have all the kids of John Loftus and Ellen Noon. I'm very fortunate to have this photo. This is on their wedding day, 1911. So I treasure this photo, as I don't have many photos from my dad's side, especially from this generation. So, but, oh yeah, and if anyone's wondering what the heart means, it means that this person married. If they had the little kind of like the feet, that means that they had kids. But there are at least two people in the kids lineup here who weren't registered. And those happen to be Tom and Margaret. So when I was doing research, I couldn't quite figure out why. I I ended up hallucinating for a while, thinking that I did have a birth from Margaret, when it turns out I didn't. I got the date from some other record. So I didn't have a birth record for her, but thought for a very long time that I did. But Tom, I didn't have a birth for. The only, and in case you're wondering, no, this isn't a typo. Luke was born the 11th of January 1912, and Tom was purportedly the 20. And this is what I say about using other records, because Tom, as well as John and Michael and Jim, the four of them had all moved over to England, and Michael, Jim, and Tom had settled in London, whereas John settled in Yorkshire. And with Tom, the only source I have for his birthday is from his death index. So when he died in 1992, it gave his birthday as the 25th of December, 1912. However, I've also heard from other family members who say it's the 22nd or the 24th. So the only thing I can confirm is that it is more than likely December of 1912. So I will have to try and look for a baptism to see if I can get any further with that. But it just goes to show you that despite the rules being quite tight and being quite, I suppose, they weren't really, they were quite rigid. They weren't going to be moving a whole lot with regulations. It just goes to show that not everything is recorded, as we all might assume. Another thing is, some people might also talk about, we've all joked about it, I'm sure, sometimes, where we have, the vampire ancestors, or we just have our brick walls. Chances are we've already found them, but we just didn't necessarily realize it. Because when I was doing research in Cork and Dublin, especially, I would often come across an unidentified individual, and it would give me a rough age and the cause of death, and that they would surmise to be the case. And we'd often call those John and Jane Does now, but chances are all we know is they're somebody's family. They might be one of yours. We just don't necessarily know, and we might not know. So there are always going to be some things that we might not be able to solve, no matter how hard we try. But all we can do as people who research and document our family history, we do our best, and we try and prove each step of the way with documentation and accounts. And oral accounts are a great source too. They can often give you a jump start into trying to find other records, or they might have some historical context that records won't give you. Anyhow, I digress. One other thing that I do like to talk about is the Civil Registration Index. So, where Irish genealogy wraps up at 100 years before, so technically I say it's the 101 year wait for births, because we'd be getting 1924 births in 2025, and basically just add in 101 to the year that you're wanting. So for example, if I wanted 1927, I'd be waiting until 2028. So that's a good rule to add in. And it's the same goes for marriages and deaths, I say the 76-year rule and the 51-year rule. So even though it's technically 100, 75, and 50. Anyhow, so with births ending online at the moment for 1923, and eventually they will add 1924 this year. For any births that occurred after that, if I want to try and find perhaps how many kids a couple had, it'll help me figure out, I suppose, who it helps probably if you're trying to trace towards living people now, but it bridges part of the way. But I'm not great with searching for living people, so do not consult me for tips with that. So the only downside with this collection is that the mothers' maiden names are missing for any records between 1924 to 1928, but this won't be a problem in 2029 when we will have 1928 or up to 1928 births on Irish genealogy. But granted, that's a few years yet, so we'll stay in the here and now. But probably the most fundamental part is it helps you to order a copy of a cert that happened after what's available on Irish genealogy from the GRO. So anything up to now, essentially. But the births, marriages, and deaths only go up to 1958. So anything after that, you're kind of having to do more research to try and pin down or pinpoint a more precise date or record that might be the one that you're after. So I'll show you an example of a birth index, a marriage index, and a death index. So this is from my grandaunt Teresa. So this is a birth index where I can see Teresa M. Carney is her name. She was born in the second quarter of the year, so anywhere between April, May, or June of 1928. She was in June. She was a different part. So 1928, I can see it was in Swinford, and I can see when the birth was registered. What country even it's going to be Ireland, and the mother's maiden name, and then using that I can then go and find a marriage for the parents, provided it's online, of course, and then it gives me a reference number. Now whenever you order a cert from the GRO, you would need, or the General Register Office, you would need to include this volume number and page number to help them expedite your query quicker. Same goes for the marriage, where you can see John Loftus, 1911, April, May, June, Swinford, Ireland. But with marriage indexes, it gives you all the people listed on the page that the marriage is on. So I can see John Loftus, but I can see Ellen Noon. But these names aren't together. So it doesn't imply that those married together. So for all I know, if I didn't know any better, I might have assumed that it was John Loftus and Kate Walsh, even though that might not be true. But because John's marriage is online, I can look at that anyway. And then the death index, again, I still have the reference number and approximate year of birth based on the age given and the date of registration. And as I said, for 1864 to 1871 or 70, I keep forgetting, deaths, they are only indexed, but this is from the old Irish genealogy site, so there is no half of this information isn't actually given anymore, because with the new site reconfiguration, you only get the death, the name, the year, but there's no age given, and there's none of this. So if you are looking for any of the indexes, I would recommend looking up on the other sites that do have them, which are on your handout if you need them. But the images for any births any deaths between this period are viewable in Salt Lake City if you happen to be there at the moment, or in any family search library, I believe. Then I can use this, for example, I went looking for a couple, so I could actually pinpoint based on where I knew the family to be in the Swinford district. I could see, these are the kids that they had, so I can use that to help me along. I added in the tips for ordering. So I have the email that you will need. That is also in your handout, and I implore you, if you do email off to the GRO for a birth, marriage, or death certificate, do include the volume number, the page number, and the mother's maiden name, if applicable. So that's what I'd include if I was asking for this. But just try and include as much information as you can in your query. If you were looking for a research copy, it would be a €5 fee. If it is a certified copy, should the need arise, it would be €20 when you apply with that or when you email that email address. And that is where my presentation ends. I actually am surprised that I did it nicely in 45 minutes. So now I'm going to take questions. But if you want to keep up with me on social media, find my website or any other things, go to this link. It has everything. And if there are any questions that I don't get to after this session, please do email me. And that is my email address. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. That was great. We do have several questions here. I'll just start here. It says, if our dates are 1750 and 1739 for the birth, where are we to go looking for more information?
Okay, so primarily, apologies, I thought I was still in full screen. So essentially, if you're looking for any sort of birth at that time, you are not going to be finding a birth for that time. If anything, you'll be finding a baptism, is what you'll be looking for at that point. But even then, it'll be quite some, I suppose, it'll be quite difficult to find potentially. So just bear that in mind. If you do manage to get to that, I suppose, time period, good on you. It was hard for me to try and get back to that point. So if you do manage that, good going.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, this one, we'll see if you've got anything on this. It says, trying to get my mom Irish citizenship, need grandmother's birth certificate, but doesn't have her grandmother's first name. Any additional record that I can add?
Okay, so, oh goodness. You might be better off emailing me on that one, but I will try. For that one, I would say, if you didn't necessarily know the grandmother's name, think about other family members, because did that grandmother have maybe a sister or brother that you can look for? Because if you can sort of replicate a search that you'd be wanting to do for your grandmother and find that perhaps for a grandaunt or a granduncle, then you may be able to do a search on Irish genealogy for the so like, for example, any kids. So let's say it was Smith and Jones. So the mother was Jones and the father was Smith. So you could do a search between, or a search for any kids with the surname Smith with the mother's surname Jones, and it might actually show up what your grandmother's birth cert is. But if you need any help, I'm more than happy to try and point you in the right direction. But that would be how I do it if I didn't necessarily know the first name.
Awesome. Thank you. Next one. Does farmer mean that they owned land or leased the land?
So in my case, I believe it was, so if I was to go back a generation on, for example, John Loftus and Ellen Noon, John's father was given as a landholder when John was born. So he held land, and then I believe, because John did have a farm, so farmer, in terms of whether they owned or leased it, I'm not quite sure. I'd have to ask my dad on that one, but I think they probably did own it, because I think there was some spat later on about it.
And in general, I guess, would farmer, it could mean either potentially?
You might see farm laborer as well, which means that they perhaps might have worked on someone else's farm as an employee, or someone that did kind of work on it. But farmer, at least what I've come across, is kind of those who had owned it or owned the land that they farmed.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let's see. I have family from Ballintoy County, Antrim, and Letterkenny County, Donegal, but no parents. Where do I go?
Okay, so with that, I'd probably need a bit more information to try and help on that one. So again, if you want to email me, because I'm not sure I'll have time to kind of answer it here, by all means do. But with that one, you would probably want to just try and document what you have and just see if you can maybe chart, like, because genealogy, we always kind of think of it in a straight line, but sometimes you have to go a bit wavy in terms of how you do searching to try and get on to that straight line. But it's sort of, yeah, it can be challenging. I'll give it that.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. My husband's Gilmartin family came to America around 1852. I have not been able to find Catholic records for Sligo, Ireland. Any suggestions?
So that would greatly depend on what is online, because the National Library of Ireland does have parish registers online, to, I suppose, and it all depends on the parish, because if you have a parish, sometimes the starting date might be a bit sooner, they might be a bit more recent. It all depends on what's online for that parish. So the National Library of Ireland parish registers would be one place to go. RootsIreland.ie would be another place to go, because they do have transcripts of parish records. However, what their coverage is like, I'm not entirely sure. But for the National Library of Ireland parish records, they do not contain transcripts. So if you were trying to, I suppose, find any, information from that, you would be better off probably going to other sites, subscription-based sites that do have those collections, but they will be transcribed to a degree. They might not be perfect, but they might be a starting point.
Okay. Great, thanks. Then this one is adding an E to Clark on the end an Irish or English thing?
Sometimes it may have been down to phonetics, because sometimes, depending on if it wasn't a surname a registrar might have been familiar with, they might have just wrote it out, kind of think, okay, Clark, what does that sound like? It might be Clark, but sometimes they might do that sounds like it might have an E, like Clark, like, it might have a silent T on the end, so they might stick an E on it. It varies, because there's no kind of one. But if you are looking for variants of surnames, John Grenham's website does have variants listed on it. If you do type in a name to the website, or if you want to consult with Edward MacLysett, MacLysaght. His book, The Surnames of Ireland, might give you an idea on terms of other variations of surnames. So that might be another place to look. I don't know if it's directly an Irish or an English thing, though.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you. This next one, pretty cool. I just noticed Swinford. My wife has Loftus ancestors from near Castlebar, Borodruma. The trail ends at Walter McGarry and Bridget Loftus, and they have two different spellings, yes. Loftuss and Loftis. Probably born in early 1800s. Do you have a family tree somewhere that I can see?
I do, on Ancestry. So my profile on there is the profile picture you see for me on my speaker profile, and the screen name is Daniel M with a dot after that, and then Loftus. So it's as if I was writing out my name with my middle initial. I do have a tree there. I don't think, I could be wrong, I don't have any relations from Borodruma, but you're more than welcome to have a look and message me, and we can try and see if we get anywhere. But yeah, if there are any people out there that do have potential relations, let me know, because I can't find many.
Nice. Let's see. Relation Alexander Campbell, born in Ireland 1798, died in Nova Scotia 1870. Cannot find in Nova Scotia, Canada, other than death record that notes father is William. Any hints to break the brick wall?
So again, looking at So yeah, anything before 1864, you are not going to you are not going to get like a birth, a marriage, or a death cert. Although if it's a non-Catholic marriage, you will get that up to 1845. But prior to 1845, you will not get any degree of civil registration anywhere. So if you are looking for anything from that period, you are going to primarily be looking at what's it called? You're going to be looking for baptisms again. So it's kind of going to be that.
Yeah.
And it goes back to my earlier point about where to find baptisms and the like. So bear that in mind too.
Great, thank you. This I don't know if this is a comment or question, but it says the new site does not list mother's maiden name in birth search results that used to be listed on old site. Need to check records to identify them.
Yeah, so that's a very valid point that I actually forgot to make. So thank you to whoever pointed that one out. So essentially with that, any birth prior to, I believe it's like 1898, 99, it depends on the place, there will not be a birth, or sorry, there will not be a mother's maiden surname given on the record. It'll only be given after, like definitely from 1900 on, there will be a mother's maiden name recorded on the birth. But no, that person is correct in terms of if you were looking for any sort of births there, you would have to go looking at each individual one. And I know that very well because I've done an awful lot of Waterford research where the surname involves a lot of powers and they're everywhere. So I often have to look through hundreds to try and find the one that I'm looking for.
Okay, wow. Okay, next one. Pretty broad. Hopefully you've got something. It says, all I know is Kelly and born in Ireland. Where do I start? I'm guessing that's the last name.
Boy. That's going to be a very hard one to kind of answer because if you don't necessarily know a whole lot of information, then you're not really going to be able to get very far with it. I mean, I'd probably need to know a bit more about that query before I can try and answer that. So apologies to that person.
Yeah, no worries. Let's see. Not found anything for relative born in 1802, Co Galway. Records burned or non-existent.
Oh, County Galway. Well, non-existent because again, civil registration for everything, births in particular for this query, began in 1864. So there would be no birth cert for 1802.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. And then, did the British gentry own a lot of farmland in Ireland and employ managers to manage?
Not entirely sure on that front. I'm not well versed in that area, but I just realized I didn't have my email address up there. I had the title slide, so well done me. So there we go. Someone was trying to get anywhere with that. Okay, there you
go. Okay. Let's see. Is there an equivalent of Find a Grave for Ireland for cemetery monuments?
Best place to try and direct you for that one. There's a number of places, but because I'm running out of time, there's one. I did a podcast episode called, and there's not many podcast episodes I've done, which is the Irish Genealogy Podcast. I had done one episode on burial places or burial websites to try and find information for. So it'd be worth consulting with that, so that there's plenty to work with there. So just to bear that in mind too.
Yeah. Okay. Probably last one. We'll see if we get through it. And if not, thank you again so much. Great. And here's his email. So anyway, my grandmother, last name was Hardy, born in 1871 in England, but her parents were from Ireland, and I can't find them for 30 years. Would her father's last name be different when searching Irish records?
Hardy itself as a surname, I wouldn't have thought would have many variants, so I don't think it would change a whole lot if you were trying to find them in Ireland. Again, it would depend on where they might have come from in Ireland and what kind of records are out there and available for people. That would also depend on it as well.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you again so much. And everyone watching, thanks for being here and have a great day. Have a great rest of your day.